I'm back. In my last video, you saw me drop the keel, and now my keel is firmly reattached to the boat. It was a difficult process, and I made a ton of mistakes along the way, so I'm going to hide nothing. I'll tell you about all my mistakes, and I hope if you do this job, you won't make the same mistakes I did. So, in order to do this project, the first thing is to clean all the surfaces. So you can see here in this clip, I'm slowly working at the keel bolts with a screwdriver and a hammer, and I'm just trying to take off all of the sealant and clean up the bolts. You'll also notice that that bottom surface where the keel is, that lead, is nice and shiny. So what I've done there is I went over it with sandpaper, I cleaned it with acetone, and then I put a thin layer of epoxy down. So that's why it's nice and shiny, and that's a nice bonding surface. Once I'd done those two jobs, then the next step was to prep the top of the keel stub. So you can see here I have a really handy little sandpaper, what would you call this? It's like a belt sander tool. So this was my friend Dan. He is in a boat just across from me, and he has every tool under the sun. Dan, if you're watching this, thank you so much for loaning me your tools. I wouldn't be here without you. Yeah, really handy tool, and the whole point here is just scuff the top surface and turn that into a really nice bonding surface for the epoxy. So that is the preparation of all the surfaces. Now at the bottom we have a nice smooth epoxy layer, the threads are clean, the top surface is sanded. Okay, one of my friends, Robert, has helped me tremendously here. So what we have on the bottom layer and around all of those bolts is mold release wax. And the plan now is to get some epoxy and thicken it, and then we're gonna fill up this gap. I mean, not fill the gap, we're just gonna put, a thin layer in there, and then raise the mast up so that whole section is filled, and then we'll have a nice mating surface between the bottom and the top. That's the plan in any case. I'm pretty disappointed with myself on how I did the epoxy layer between these two. So let me show you. So down here I have a smooth epoxy layer which is bonded to the lead of the keel, and on top of that I put mold wax release layer. Then I put in here a bunch of thickened epoxy and brought the keel up. And the idea there was to make a smooth surface between here and there. So we have I want the surfaces to match. I don't want the sealant to be a gap filler. So that was the whole point, was to fill gaps. Now I actually didn't have enough materials with me. I thought I did, but it turns out I didn't. So I have lots of areas where the epoxy just didn't bond to the top. So I've peeled a bunch of that off. You see here I have good bonding, this little patch, and here I don't. Here good bonding again. So it sucks because it's really touch and go where I had good bond and where I didn't. So I'm scraping off as much as I can because I want no air pockets in there. Then I have to redo that whole process again. So that means once I get all this off and I sand it down so we have a nice ready to bond surface on the top, then I'm going to go along the bottom and make sure that I have, let me show you an example. Yeah, see here how the epoxy did bond on the bottom. I need to make sure that comes off. It needs to be a single layer of epoxy on the lead. So I have to redo all that. Do it good the first time if you can. That's the lesson. Well, as you saw, my first attempt was a big failure. I did not have enough epoxy or thickener, and critically I was using slow hardener for the epoxy, which in the weather here in Mexico, it's so hot right now, it kicks off very quickly. So West System makes it's called 209. It's an extra slow hardener, which is specific for really hot weather. That's what I ended up buying for my second attempt, which went quite a bit better, but was still not a success. So let's take a look at our prep work.
and then take a look at how it went.
That's the mold release wax, and you just paint it on. It doesn't need a lot. A thin coat will do. So even that is a lot. So I'm being very careful to just get it on the bottom and on the threads, but not on the top, because wherever I paint this wax down, there will be no bond. So just the bottom. I don't need a lot. Just good coverage. That's the important part. And so on. That's all I'm doing. We're ready to go. The wax here is dried. So now the solvent that wax comes in is dried up. It's just wax. We have a nice smooth surface below, and the top is sanded and cleaned it with acetone. So now we put thickened epoxy in there. I'll show you what I've done. So I pre-made my thickened batches. So this is just epoxy, no hardener. So that is 12 pumps in each of these. Last time I basically made 2 batches like this, and then kind of half-assed a third batch, but didn't really go in okay. So I wanted to have more and have it ready. The other thing is I wanted longer working time, so I got this extra slow hardener. What I used last time was the slow hardener. So I have this ready on hand in case I run out, but I'm going to be working with this primarily, the extra slow hardener. To make it thicker, I've used the microfiber filler. That is basically chopped up fiberglass, and that will makes this, a lot thicker, which is just what I want. So yeah, I'm going to just check that these are the thickness I like, and once I get started, the plan is 12 pumps in, mix it up, and then use this thin long piece of aluminum to quickly get it out of here and up in there. The longer I leave it in a big batch like that, the faster it will start to get hot and kick off. So it's important that I mix it up very quickly, get it where I want it. So I'll put in 12 pumps, mix, put that in, 12 pumps, mix, get it in, and so on. Hopefully this is enough. But because I have the extra slow hardener, I think if I need to mix up a couple more batches on the fly, I'll be okay. So I'm going to put you over here. We're going to get started. Now what I've done is using the jack and torquing up the bolts up top, I've pulled the keel up. And just like we want to see, this is gooping out of the sides. There's a couple areas where it's not gooping out, and that's bad. So I'm going to mix up one more batch of thickened epoxy, and I have a tube with a syringe-like tip that I can stuff in there and then force epoxy in. So there's only a couple little gaps like that. The coverage inside I think was pretty good. So these are just places where the gap was bigger than I expected near the edge. So I want to make sure it looks like that all the way around, which is so far pretty good. All right, so here, just pulled the keel down after the epoxy cured. So because of the mold release wax, I was able to just take these plugs of epoxy straight off of the bolts. It was really easy. You can see all the debris in there. Now everything worked really well except for one thing. That is back here, you can see where the thickened epoxy ends. So all this I was able to take off really easily because it was delaminating quite badly. And so what I think happened was, after I laid down the thickened epoxy, I used the jack, a combination of tightening the bolts and the jack to get this keel to move up. And the jack puts a lot of pressure on the back. So I think I raised this really tightly in the back, like almost like the keel rocked backwards like this. And then I tightened up all the bolts But that jack, it's not a very good jack, and it loses pressure pretty quickly over time. So I think the jack settled, and then the keel rocked forward. And I believe that pivot point was right about here, because here I can see that the epoxy is very, very thin. So as expected, up here, the adhesion seems really good. And then back here, the adhesion was very poor. And then actually right here, you can see there's a bit of oil. And that oil led to bad adhesion around the bolt hole. So a small bit of unadhered epoxy around here, I don't mind. I can just take that out and we'll fill that with the Sikaflex. But a large area like this, I'm just gonna have to redo it. So now the plan is basically exactly what I've done 2 times before. Sand the top, wax on the bottom, thickened epoxy, and pull the keel back up. But this time, I will pull it up with the threads, not with that. So it goes. So, schooled by the jack once again. If there's a lesson in this, it's make sure that that keel moves up to the stub in a slow and consistent manner, and is always moving closer together and never further apart. And that's where using the jack wasn't a great idea. If I just torqued the bolts to pull the keel up, it would have slowly moved up and up and up, but never back down. So that was a good lesson to learn with the epoxy, because then that was a mistake I did not make with the sealant. So keep that one in mind if you're doing this yourself. The other lesson there, if you saw those little oil stains, is make sure your bilge is clean, because if you have oil dripping down from the bilge, it's going to mess up your nice clean work surface. So that was a constant problem for me. There is a little bit of oil seepage in the bilge, and you know, I really need to keep that under control if I'm going to make a good seal at any point here. Let me show you what I got here. So yesterday, I had to redo the thickened epoxy on the rear section because it was peeling off. Now that it's cured, I've pried it back just a little bit. You probably can't see well on the camera, but that's a really well adhered surface up in there. So I think finally I have that perfect mating surface that I wanted. Meaning, when I tighten up those bolts, the surface of the keel and this thickened epoxy, they make contact along the entire length of the keel. So that's going to be really easy to seal. Great. Finally, after 3 tries, I had my mating surfaces ready to go. So the only missing thing before you actually put sealant in there is make sure that everything is prepared to actually make a good bond. So what that meant for me was to get the lift under my boat and completely remove the hole from the keel. Now with some space to work, I could get all of the surfaces ready. So there were several steps to this. One, I needed to run a hole saw through the actual keel bolt holes. There's a bunch of leftover sealant in there, so just running a hole saw through it was a quick and easy way to just knock all that sealant off and get those edges nice and roughened and ready for fresh sealant. The next step I had to do was clean up all of the bolts because they had old sealant on it. And here what I found really easy was a bit of paint thinner and a wire wheel brush mounted on a drill bit, or sorry, on an electric drill. So basically it's just a rotating wire wheel and it just knocks that sealant right off. And that worked really well. Then I had to also prep the top and bottom surfaces, and this is pretty easy. It's just run some sandpaper over both the surfaces, and I used a lot of acetone and paint thinner here just to make sure that there was no mold release wax left on any of those surfaces. So once I was satisfied that I just had roughened epoxy and or fiberglass, then I felt I was ready to actually put some Sikaflex into this joint and bring both of them together. All right, we did the thing. That means all my bolts are super clean. I sanded the bottom and cleaned it. Same with the top. Ran a hole saw through each of those holes. So we're ready for some glue. Oh, it's actually 2 places. Here I had a strap, here I had a strap. So I'll just clean those with some acetone and a little sandpaper. And the plan is to get Sikaflex on the threads and all along here. And then I'm going to bring the keel up so I have a 2mm gap all around. That's my plan. So let's clean it up and get it going. Right, this was a real scramble for the finish line, but I made it. You'll notice there's some white and some black. I didn't realize I had different colors. And by the end, I wasn't even sure if I had enough sealant. I managed to make do and spread it as wide as I could. And then just cranked up on those nuts until it was definitely coming out everywhere. And that was a good solution. Right now the keel is floating. That's just there as a safety precaution, but it's not taking any weight. Yeah, so I'm gonna go to Tucson and get more stuff. We're just gonna let that cure for several days. And once it's fully cured, then we can weight the keel and torque those bolts down to full spec. That's it, just about. Well, as you saw there, once again, not enough raw materials on hand. That was a really silly mistake that was very easily avoidable. I had 4 tubes of Sikaflex on hand, and in retrospect, I should have had 6. So I used 2 tubes just to coat all of the bolt surfaces, and that only left me with 2 to actually get along the mating surface between the keel and the stub. And I think I would have been a lot better off with 4 tubes there. Another lesson for me was it's pretty hard to get that sealant out of the tube quickly, and if you're trying to squeeze 4 to 6 tubes of sealant out, you want to do it fast. So what I would do next time is cut that nozzle a little bit lower down where it's wider and you can get more Sikaflex out. Like, you're not doing a precision job here, you just need to get it out and in place as fast as you can. Another thing that would have been really handy for me then is probably a short 6 to 12 inch piece of hose that would have fit over that nozzle, and that would have allowed me to group that Sikaflex right into the middle of the joint, because I couldn't actually fit my sealant gun between that gap between the keel stub and the keel. So that's something to think about, is how are you going to get that sealant out quickly and where you need it to go. And of course, make sure you have enough of it. It should go without saying. So once I did that, it was pretty much ready to go. Now, this is what brings me to the biggest mistake I made of all of these mistakes. Everything I did here that I showed you was solvable. The big mistake I made, and I'd highly recommend that you don't make this mistake, is when I made that mating surface between the keel stub and the keel with that thickened epoxy, I took 0 effort to make sure that the keel was vertically aligned with the hull. So as you can see in this picture, I think you can see in this picture, I can see it, that keel is about 1.5 degrees off of vertical. And so what happened there is that my hull was not exactly balanced in the stands, and then the keel, wanting to hang, finds its own vertical. So because of that, I ended up creating a mating surface between the keel and stub that is not exactly perpendicular to the axis of the boat, or to the axis of the hull, I should say. And so that was the biggest mistake of all, because now that means my boat is going to naturally want to list a bit to starboard, and it's not going to have the same sailing performance on a port or starboard tack. Now my thought is the angle that it is off of vertical is not enough for me to be hugely concerned about it. I think if I was a racer, I would definitely have to redo this, but as a cruiser, I don't think the impact is going to be that big. And I actually did attempt to take the keel back off, but that Sikaflex is so tenacious that it looked like I would be signing myself up for another 2-week project that I'm just not prepared to undertake. So at this point, I have to accept that I have a slightly wonky keel,
That was a big mistake, and it really took the wind out of my sails, because that was the whole way along this project. I really tried hard to do everything right and do everything properly, and it never occurred to me to actually check that keel was perfectly perpendicular to the hole. So if you're doing this project, that is something I'd recommend you be very careful about. The last aspect to this project that I feel is probably one of the more important ones is replacing the fasteners. So I chose not to reuse the nuts that are sitting in the bilge and all kind of rusty. So I went onto a site called Bolt Depot. I'm not sponsored by them, but I am happy with the products I received. So I got 316 stainless washers, lock washer, and replacement nuts. So I think fresh nuts is going to be a good thing. Now, the surface area of this washer I don't feel is sufficient for actually holding up a keel. So another thing I did was I designed some backing plates, and I had these cut out of 304 stainless. So it's about, I believe this is 3/16 plate, which seems chunky and sufficient. I mean, I could have gone up to 1/4 inch, but I think this will be just fine. And so what I did is I cut out of paper. Specifically, I used graph paper because it was really easy to make square cuts and know exactly how long each dimension was. And I cut out what I felt would be adequate backing plates for each of the different keel bolts. So this just fits over the bolt. Then we put on a washer, and then the lock washer, and then the nut, and that gets cranked down. So I think with larger backing plates, the forces will get much more evenly distributed, and I think it'll be far less likely that my bolts lose torque, or that my nuts lose torque. I noticed with the washers that are sitting in the bilge that, actually let me get you one. Here we go. This is an example of what I feel a washer should not look like. It's great that it's shiny, but look at that conical shape that it has, right? So you can see that as that nut was getting torqued down, it deformed the washer, and that deformation might not have been instantaneous. It may have been, as you're out there sailing, that's when the washer starts to deform. And then, you know, my nut, which was torqued down to 200 foot-pounds, suddenly has the equivalent of maybe 50 foot-pounds of torque. So looking at this washer, it's no surprise that I had a smile at the front of the keel. And I believe, I'm not sure, but I'll tell you how it goes, but I believe that having backing plates like this, assuming they don't deform, that they're large enough to handle those loads, then they'll hold that torque a lot more effectively, and it's less likely for the smile to develop. In retrospect, thinking about all the issues I've had taking this keel off, all of the difficulties involved, and the fact that my bolts were in perfect condition, if I could go back and do it all over again, what I would have done is just dug out some of the old sealant where the keel had a smile. So I was at the front and the back of the keel. I would have just pumped fresh sealant into that gap, and then up top here in the bilge I would have pulled out the old nuts and bolts and just make some of these, get some fresh fasteners, and torque everything down to spec. And I think that would have solved my problem and would have taken me about 10% of the time and effort that this project took me. But it's done. Got a wonky keel, but it looks like it'll at least be well sealed and well supported. So that's that project. Thanks for watching.
When it's hot.